nchez Syrian.
Thank you very much. I want first to thank the Pontifical Academy of Science for inviting me here, particularly Pierre Lena and Kearney Ross, who have been generous enough to invite me to share with you my experience working in refugee camps and emergency crisis in the last years. I want to talk about what has been my work for the best part of the last 15 years, which are refugee camps and refugees. I want to talk about refugees, and it's interesting that now in Europe everybody's talking about the refugee crisis because we are receiving in our shores hundreds of thousands of refugees. The sad fact is that in the world there are close to 60 million refugees. You probably have heard the figure, because it has been repeated again and again, that we are now at the highest number of refugees since World War II. And this is dramatic, and it's true. Remember that we are only talking about refugees, internally displaced people. We are not even talking about the people that are forced to flee because of natural disasters or the economic migrants. We are just talking in these figures about the people who flee conflict. One of the striking, if you look at that chart, one of the striking features is that while in the last 10 years, all the major social indicators of the world have gone better, child mortality, every single social indicator that you can look at has actually improved at different measures. In spite of that, the situation of refugees is growing worse and worse, and the number is getting bigger and bigger, which basically it's an enormous indictment of the world on the world. We are doing something very wrong when the number of people fleeing conflict is systematically increasing. This has consequences and this has causes. The number of refugees has consequences and causes. For the consequences, the number that suffer more disproportionately, the people that suffer disproportionately from conflict are children. Half of the refugees in the world, of the internally displaced people in the world, are children. This is not a refugee crisis, this is a refugee and a children crisis in the world. If we look at the figure concerning the children that actually flee because of natural disasters, then we're talking about probably for this decade, we're talking about 175 million children. If you think about the figure of refugees in the world, 59.5 million, and I insist, this is only people fleeing conflict. If there were one country, there would be the 24th country in the world, which is something really devastating. I talked about the consequences, how conflict affects disproportionately children. I also want to talk about causes, because this is one of the reasons that we are gathered here, is to talk about environment. This is a map on the water risk, regions of the world on the water stress or water risk. It was compiled by the World Resource Institute. If you look at the extreme red areas, these are the places of the world that are really suffering from water stress and are at risk of suffering more. The US Department of Agriculture put together another one concerning the regions of the world more affected by desertification. And if you put together water risk with environmental degradation, with risk of desertification, and you look at the map, you will not be surprised to know that 9 of the 10 most dramatic conflicts that the world lives today, they are in these areas. Let me be clear. Natural environmental degradation and climate change are not the only reason leading to conflict, but they are a reason leading to conflict. In Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in South Sudan, in the Palestine-Israeli territories, in Somalia and in Yemen, in all these places, water and environmental degradation are major reasons for conflict, in all of them. I want to talk briefly about 2 of them. One of them is Syria. We constantly, when we hear about talking about the conflict in Syria, we're all the time hearing about the government, the opposition, and the Islamic State. Rarely we hear about the environmental reasons that were a trigger that helped to create the situation that made the country explode. From 2005 to 2009, Syria went through the worst drought that has been recorded. By the year 2009, 800,000 people had gone below the poverty line. By the year 2011, this figure was up to 2 million. Many of these people, and we're talking about herders, people living in rural areas, they moved to the cities where they had no job. Many of those people are now fighting. Of course, we all know that there were many other reasons that led to the conflict, but certainly environmental issues was a major trigger of the conflict in Syria. The other place that I want to talk about is the Sahel region, particularly the part of the world between Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. I've worked many years of my life in the Sahel region, and there is a clear correlation between environmental degradation and the emergence of Boko Haram that has been signaled and repeated by an enormous amount of studies. Everybody that has lived and worked in the Sahel region knows that the desertification is growing and the patterns of rain are becoming more erratic. If we think about, again, Boko Haram did not emerge solely because of environmental degradation, but it was certainly a major cause for it. The consequences are dramatic. In the last years, 1.2 million children have fled the crisis in northern Nigeria. Only in the past 5 months, while Europe is so concerned about the refugees coming to our shores, only in the past 5 months, 500,000 children have been displaced because of the situation in northern Nigeria. And this is the problem. The problem is that it's not only that refugees are fleeing, it's not only that children are suffering most, but it touches directly on education. And we have, out of those hundreds of millions of children that are affected by conflict, 28.5 million of them are out of school. And for me, this is a crucial figure, because if the world has not achieved the Millennium Development Goal on education, has been to a large extent because of conflict. We can talk about many other things, and again, many other factors play. But the reality is that half of the children who are out of the school in the world today are in conflict-affected areas. And this leads me to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the first thing that I want to say about the Sustainable Development Goals is that I think that everybody that has followed the process, I think that they are one of the greatest achievements in world history. It's the most ambitious agenda that we have set, and it's really remarkable that we have managed, all the countries of the world have managed to put together this agenda. It's funny to think that most of the criticism that the SDGs have received, or the Global Development Goals have received, is because they are too wide, too big. There are too many things. For me, it's even more important to remark what it's not inside of them. And as long as refugees and IDPs and internally displaced people are included in the preamble, in the document, they are completely absent from the goals and the targets. They are nowhere to be seen. Conflict, humanitarian crisis, refugees, they are nowhere to be seen. And this is one of the reflections that I want to make myself and ourselves today. How are we supposed to get to zero, to get every single child in school and provide decent quality education with decent learning outcomes if we don't focus on those half of the children out of school that are living in conflict-affected areas? The problem with being absent of the SDGs, and I insist, being explicitly absent. Of course, somebody would say that when we talk about vulnerable children, we include them. When we talk about all children, we include them. But the fact is that they are not mentioned there. There are two main problems with not being included in one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. The first one is that countries will give funding according to the targets. This is one of the goals of the SDGs, is to gather and to garner attention, advocacy, and therefore funding. And refugee children are absent from these targets. The other second problem is that the SDGs, from my point of view, rightly so, they are very incredibly focused on the country lead. So countries are supposed to lead on the implementation of the SDGs. The problem is that refugees do not belong to a country. Refugees are not included in the developmental strategies of countries. So we really risk leaving these 59.5 million people aside from all our developmental programs. And I'm going to touch on this through three very quick examples. The first one is Syria, and the Syrian crisis and the Syrian refugees, and I came back yesterday from Jordan. You might know that in Jordan there are 630,000 Syrian refugees. The situation of these refugees is dramatic. There is no other way of putting it. Most of these refugees, 80%, live outside refugee camps. They have been integrated in the communities, in local communities. The Jordanian government does not allow Syrian refugees to work in their country. The Jordanian government has not signed the Refugee Convention, so they think that they are allowed to impede refugees from working. Syrian teachers cannot teach Syrian children. So now in the schools in Jordania, children are doing double shifts, and they have shortened the hours of school for Jordanians and for Syrians, and the children are not able to complete and to have a decent education. Children that many of them were used to have it. This is not the only problem. Since Syrian refugees are denied the chance of working, children, what is the hope for you to complete secondary education if you know that you will not be allowed to work later? Many children are dropping out of school. The last 2 years have been dramatic because even if we had children in school, now they are dropping out of school. That is not the only problem. Because of lack of funding and resource shortages, many Syrian children in Jordan have had to leave school and work in the informal sector. If you think about it, if they don't allow you to work formally, you go to the informal sector. But if you work in the informal sector, your wages go down, and there is no labor protection for you, and this is the situation of more and more children who are desperate. What is their hope? What do they want to do? Well, Germany is a much better option than living in this place that is not changing. I also want to talk about the Sahel region. Particularly, this is a school in the refugee camp of Melkadida in the border between Somalia and Ethiopia. I worked for a long time there. The problem that we're having in the refugee camps of southern Ethiopia is that refugees have been there already for 5 years. There is little hope at this moment for refugees to go back to Somalia. One of the reasons is the drought in Somalia right now, apart from the war. Many of the refugees of the world live in protracted crisis. They have been there for 5, 10, 15 years, and as years go by, finance drags down. So the amount of money that the world is dedicating to protracted crisis is completely insufficient. We are able to look at the situation in Syria, to look at the last crisis, but we quickly forget about the other ones. The problem in the Sahel region in general is that all these crises develop in slow motion. People move because of conflict, because of drought. They've been moving forever, and we kind of lose interest in them. In Somalia, this year, in this very moment, throughout the Horn of Africa, we're living through a dramatic drought that is causing people to flee again, to be on the move. People, close to 900,000 people in Somalia now have joined the ranks of the acute malnourished. And this is not only in Somalia, it's throughout the whole region. 23 million people are food insecure in the Sahel region because of drought and water scarcity. And we have to ask ourselves, where are these people going to go? In the last food crisis in Niger, in the first weeks after the food crisis, 74,000 kids left school, and they went to look for food. They went to look for somewhere to eat. The last place I wanted to talk about is the Central African Republic, where I've spent a part of this year. The crisis in Central African Republic, that I don't think that many people are following it in the news because it's absent from the news, has been flaring up again and again. The last big moment of violence has been in the last weeks. This is an IDP camp in the city of Bangui, internally displaced people. People have been living there, families, groups of families have been living in those tents for the past 2.5 years. The Pope Francis is supposed to go to the Central African Republic in the next days, but the situation of violence is so bad that we still don't know if we'll be able to get there. The question that I ask myself day after day in the Central African Republic is what will happen with these children. These are children that are in the Jesuit Refugee Service school in Grand Seminaire, and they are finishing the early childhood education, and they are supposed to start with primary education. The problem with these children is that they are about to join an educational system that, because of conflict, is completely dysfunctional. So even if we manage to get them into what we call schools, we are lying to them. We are not offering them anything that is close to any sort of education, because conflict has led to a completely dysfunctional system. And this takes me to this chain that, for me, it's the one that I'm obsessed about. After having worked for many years in conflicts, this is a perverse and dramatic change that I've seen repeated again and again. We all know that not all the environmental degradation leads to conflict. Of course not. And we all know that not all the conflicts have an environmental source, or not even an environmental component. But we also know that there is a correlation, and there is a causation in many, many cases. And that it's impossible to have a decent educational life in the middle of a conflict, or in the outcome of a conflict. I want to finish by talking about this chain, because I think that one of the things that we all think is, how can we break that chain? And I'm a hopeful and positive person by nature. So the first element of the chain, climate change leading to environmental degradation, we have to put our hopes in the leaders of the world. They are going to get together later this month in Paris, and we hope that finally we'll start to change and break that chain, that we will manage to tackle climate change and start to reverse environmental degradation. But even if that happens, even if we finally succeed to have an agreement in Paris, environmental degradation is not going to get better tomorrow. And I think that the parts of the world that are suffering from it are not going to become gardens anytime soon. So for me, the question is how to avoid environmental degradation leading to conflict, and also how to avoid conflict leading to the children, to a situation of children with no education and poor education. And it's not an easy way. There is nothing easy about solving this chain. But to concentrate on how to avoid conflict leading to children with no education, we really have to focus on the education of the forcibly displaced children. And from my point of view, and when I talked with Pierre a few weeks ago about what to do here, he insisted we have to come up with solutions, with ideas, with proposals, things that we can fight for. And for me, one of the key things that we should do in the next 15 years is place the forcibly displaced children at the heart of the developmental agenda. And they are not there. I mean, they are in the discourses, they are in the slides, but they are not there. The first thing to do is to try to make sure that forcibly displaced children, refugee children, are included in the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. They are not there. The thematic advisory group for the Education 2030 agenda that just issued their proposed indicators 2 weeks ago, coming out of the Incheon Declaration, they have identified 43 indicators. Refugees are not mentioned in there. Just in one comment to one indicator, refugees are mentioned. And I have to insist, they are half of the children out of the school of the world. The other thing that I dream of and that I would hope is that as much as MDGs evolved, the Millennium Development Goals evolved, and targets evolved, we should really have a target in the SDG number 4 for children in conflict, children affected by conflict. And this is the work of all of us trying to lobby for that to happen. I think it's probably, many people will think that this is wishful thinking. I think that this should happen and can happen. The other thing is that we need to increase the funding for children in emergencies. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon started a high-level financial commission last year in July. They're supposed to come up with a proposal in March. Again, we've heard so many pledges about increased funding that haven't become reality, that it's something to be concerned about. The last thing I would like to talk about children in conflict is we have to lobby countries to sign the Refugee Convention. We have to lobby countries to allow youngsters to work, refugee youngsters to work. I think it's a shame that countries like Jordan come to sign the Sustainable Development Goals in the big parties of New York, but then go back to their country and do not allow refugees to do what they are entitled to by the law, which is to work in the host country. My last comment is about how to break the chain of environmental degradation and conflict, and we could write books about it. But I want to concentrate on what can children do. And for me, the solution lies in the children. Many of us have been working on this for many years, and clearly we have not found a solution. So the question is, how do we make the children of the world be aware of this? And I would just like to propose two things. Complicated, but I think possible. When we talk environment to children in schools, we keep on repeating them how men affect environment, how we have managed to degrade it, how we have managed to impoverish and damage it. I think we should go a step forward and tell children how the degradation of the environment affects human beings. Go all the way to really how it comes back to us and to millions of children in the world who are suffering for environmental degradation. The last thing I would like to see is we have to provide to the youngsters, to the teenagers, knowledge about the current conflicts of the world. We have to engage them in a debate on how to solve it, because it's them, the ones that have to do this. Thank you very much.